but then we will want to try it. So anything that removes the ink is subtractive. Now if you mess up, there's no reason you couldn't now add a little bit more ink or add another color, paint directly into that. But let's just see real quick what we get. So set that there. And I'm going to this could be potentially messy, so you might err on the side of a single sheet of newsprint folded in half, or 2 sheets, depending on the size that you use. And the key is you want to be as planographic as possible, meaning as just flat as possible. No big globs of ink. Does anybody want to guess what would happen if we had like a really big globule of ink as it goes through the press? It's not only going to spread and squish, it'll actually create like a big dark line and just all the way down the paper. So, loosen this up a little. Clunk here. Don't be startled.
Oh.
I love it. Should we sand the edges of that plexiglass first?
No, great question. If it's your own plexiglass or it's plexiglass that you buy like at Home Depot, yes. But the plexiglass that we have here for you to use for free, because you're not permanently altering it, is thin enough it won't hurt the felts. So, keeping in mind this is just a very, very quick, by no means a piece of art, but you can see how the subtractive process works. And because the ink film's so squishy, you notice even with the trace monotype, it kind of filled in a little bit. So that might have been too much pressure, like we could adjust the pressure. So you might even, before committing to your final sort of design, you might just grab a piece of plexiglass and play with it or something, and just see what some different techniques are. Now, what do you think additive is?
On the plexiglass.
Yeah, so basically, it's pretty straightforward with what we just discussed, but instead of putting one solid ink film on, what we'd be doing is we'd be painting it on. And so we have a couple options. You've got your printmaking inks, which are essentially oil paint, and you want to add a little bit of this burnt plate oil to the ink to thin them, because we're going to have to brush them on and brush them on fairly thinly. We also have next door, and we can bring them over, we can interrupt the other class, we have oil paints, which are naturally thinner, and we can use those too. So you can use a variety of colors, and depending on how thick you make your additive monotype, you might have to first do a hand print to kind of clean the thickest part of ink off, because it can be thicker than you might suspect. And so Daniel, who you met a few weeks ago, one of our former students who's gone on to print graduate programs and things like that and print shows, he loves the additive technique of monotype, and he will almost universally get 3 prints out of one design. So it's almost a misnomer saying it's a monotype, because he's getting 3, but they're all different. They're not consistent like your relief block is. The first one, he'll just use really thick ink and kind of attack it, and he'll hand print it or print it with a Baron, and that will be really thick and like almost like orange peel. Then the second and third impressions, he'll run through the press. And so even though this is really oily and thin, like these little bubbles might actually squish through the press, but why don't we find out, shall we? So let's add one more thing to this. Let's say a little thicker and right. spell crow?
W.
E. Oh, yeah. Demonstration. Just a little bit. This one does not have the micrometers, so we don't know what the pressure is. That's why we have a backing sheet. Oh wow, it's just beautiful.
It's gorgeous.
Plus I'm getting fingerprints on it. So you don't have to use brushes. You can paint with your fingers. You could use different techniques. Things like plastic combs, things like anything you can use to impart your design onto this for additive or subtractive. I think it'll work. Now, one last thing before I turn you loose or ask questions. There is a tradition of doing what's called the ghost print, and I used to require it. This quarter, since we added screen print, and that's a whole nother technique, I sort of backed off on that. But there is a tradition worth mentioning that there's still some residual ink on the plate. And depending on how much pressure or how thin your ink was, you might be able to get, as the name implies, a ghost impression. So kind of faint, kind of not very bright. And they do crack from time to time. Don't worry about that. In fact, this one has damage on it anyways. But the ghost has a tradition of people pulling the ghost on a decent piece of paper, letting it dry, and then attacking the ghost with colored pencils or pastels and making a unique image that's totally outside of any sort of edition. It's almost like a painting. So the artist Edgar Degas used to do that a lot. He'd do a lot of different monotypes and then always pull a ghost, and then it wouldn't look good just on the paper as is, but it would be a nice sort of skeleton to add. Skeleton and ghost, happy Halloween. Nice sort of thing to start adding embellishments with pastels, markers, colored pencils, things like that.
Just need a pumpkin.
But just what?
Just need a pumpkin.
Yeah, just, well, I guess I could have made it in an orange.
But if you use
Orange, glad I
colored,
didn't say banana?
would you need to wet the paper if you're using colored pencils?
I'm sorry, you wouldn't use colored pencils on the plate. You would, sorry, I
Oh,
didn't make
I
that
see,
clear.
after it's
You would
printed.
draw on the
Gotcha.
ghost print itself. Because if you imagine, if I ran this through, it probably would just leave a ghost of a crow on the paper. So what questions do you have about any of this? We're using oil-based inks, right? Subtractive, I would use just the etching inks. And we're adding Easy Wipe and Setswell, and brayers, Q-tips, brushes, anything, fingers, anything to remove. And a lot of times people would use plastic palette knives or plastic cutlery and actually like squeegee the ink, because if you can imagine, when you pull the ink with your Q-tip, it might clean an area, but if you notice, it makes sort of troughs on either side. It displaces the ink. So it almost creates like a white line with two dark lines on either side. And sometimes with too much pressure, it might squish a little bit together. So it's not a precise medium, but it should be something that can be really, really inspirational for those of you who just want to try an improvisational, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Improvisation.
Thank you, type of piece. So try it out. I can look at the design that you have. It's great for tone, it's great for shading, but it's great for happy accidents too. And it's great for things like non-objective abstract designs where you're just playing with solvents and maybe dropping colors. Like maybe you have a little jar somewhere with yellow and blue and you've watered it down with mineral spirits and you're dropping little colored sort of solvent drops into your ink film and getting mixtures and sort of accidents like tie-dye and stuff. What other questions?
Tie-dye's my next.
Thanks. You're right. And I'll put some examples up on our boards. We have boards now. Isn't that cool? But like these are student examples here of this is an additive. And what's kind of nice is this one you can see as it went through the press, it did pull down, but it added to the sort of gore effect of this zombie, which is funny because I think she meant to do a portrait of, I think this is a movie star, but it turned into this very sort of Batman, Joker-looking zombie, and I just love it. So I think it's great as a zombie piece. And then,
Not with hands in that position.
sure. And then like this example where I would say this looks a lot like subtractive, but it's additive. This person used brayers. And that's the thing, you can use stencils. We have some clear plastic. You could cut shapes, right? Cut little people or whatever, and then ink those up separate and lay them on top of your ink film. So you could do multiple colors with this. So I'll come and help you individually, and we can sort of strategize what the best way to do it is. But my such strong suggestion is don't overthink this one. You could get this done in a single class period. And it says on your calendar it's due Monday. It's not. Just the woodcut or lino cut's due Monday. So if that's priority for right now. But we're going to get a new assignment on Monday. It's got a lot more steps to it. So even if you need some time on Monday to print your lino cut or your woodcut, you're getting a pretty complicated assignment on Monday. Go team, go.